everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I am sort of restraining myself from laughter because I had the unfortunate and rare incidents of recording for a while with my guests and then realizing that I hadn't actually started recording and having to start over. And so thankfully they're being very cool about it. So for all those, before we start, all those listening, if you're not familiar with the website that produces this podcast, catholicculture.org, I encourage you to go to catholicculture.org/newsletter. All right, so today I've got two people from a wonderful quarterly magazine, Dappled Things, which is a quarterly of ideas, art, and faith. I think that's right. It has been going for 20 years. It's celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, which is fantastic. It has played an important part as kind of a hub in an ongoing Catholic literary revival. And I have with me Bernardo Aparicio Garcia, founder and publisher of Dappled Things, and Rhonda Ortiz, the editor-in-chief of Dappled Things. Welcome, guys, to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So can you just give a quick summary of what the mission of Dappled Things is?
Sure. So Dappled Things basically was created to be a magazine that not only talks about culture and about Catholics in the culture, but that actually tries to create it and tries to push it forward. So we're working to create visual art, written art that is from Catholics who are working right now. So we are looking at the tradition, at the rich tradition that we have in the church, but making it also something that continues today. And so we publish nonfiction, so essays, interviews on a wide variety of cultural topics. We also publish creative nonfiction, short fiction, poetry, visual art, the occasional short play, and book reviews. So a little bit of everything.
Excellent. And what kind of readership do you have? I mean, is it mostly people who are artists themselves or like sort of intense art nerds? Do you have any just sort of like people who would be like, I don't spend my every waking hour learning about different artists, but I like this magazine because it gives me a good read, poetry, fiction. I get a little bit of a sense of what's going on in the world of Catholic ideas. Do you have a more sort of layman audience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a little bit of everything. So our subscriber base for a print journal is about 1,000. And then we have a lot more people who just read the magazine online, what we publish there. And they come, in all types. So we definitely have some people who are involved in writing or creating visual art or, something along these lines themselves. But I get a lot of mail from people who are just really happy to have something where they can delve into the faith in a different way than they can with, let's say, a magazine that might be more involved with theological or philosophical or even controversial, like church politics kind of topics, more specifically. So people say that it's a magazine where they can just kind of breathe some fresh air and kind of just delight in being Catholic and the beauty of that. And so we have a lot of different people that read the magazine. We do have one American cardinal. I'm not going to say who is a subscriber, and it even used to be delivered to one Supreme Court justice who will remain nameless. Yeah, so all sorts of people read the magazine, and it was created to be very specifically, actually.
It was Katanji, wasn't it?
What? We'll see.
Katanji Brown.
So anyway, when the magazine was started, part of something very explicitly that we did was that the founders were not just English majors or just arts majors. There were people who were, my personal background, I was a economics and international relations major. There was historian. There was, I mean, lots of different people. But, Catholics who were serious about their faith and who had a deep love for literature and the arts, but who weren't necessarily just within that world. Because one thing that I think has hurt literature very much has been this kind of insular sense of English majors writing for other English majors, and it shouldn't be like that. I mean, like the arts are for everybody. Poetry, for example, is something that has been a fundamental, popular human art form since the very beginning, since before there was even writing. It continues to be popular in many parts of the world. And
that's right.
I was shocked when I found out some years ago that there is something like a version of American Idol in the Middle East, where there's poets competing for $1 million prizes, and they're super popular.
And do they sing? Do they like chant their poetry, or is it just read?
No, they just read it out their poetry. And it's huge.
Really something.
So
now, is that in Iran? I'm just getting guess.
I think it's broadcast across the Middle East, and there's actually I think a couple of them that compete with each other.
It's amazing.
So it's kind of wild. But yeah, I think poetry has become and not just poetry, but it's a good example. It's become something that has started to seem to a lot of people like it's not for them. Like there's this kind of insular conversation that they're not a part of, and it shouldn't be like that. And so we have deliberately looked to approach the work that we publish in a way that is accessible to people, and that doesn't mean we're dumbing it down. It just means that we are, approaching it from just a broader sense of what is good work.
Great. Now, I wanted to ask Rhonda how you got involved with the magazine.
So I've been involved with Dappled Things for about a decade. I came on initially as art director, so the person who does all the graphic design, the layout, the cover design. Graphic design is one of the many things in my back pocket. And so I came on in that capacity. Eventually, webmaster work was added to that. I took a few years off to work on my own projects, and also actually to found Chrism Press, which is celebrating today its 5th anniversary.
Wow!
But it was founded. My co-founder is Karen Eula, who used to be Dappled Things. Who used to be the managing editor.
Sure, yeah.
For us. So we can come back around to all the little different connections within the Catholic world that have passed through Dappled Things. And then eventually, in 2020, I came back on as webmaster, and then when Katie Carl, my predecessor, stepped down after many years of having the helm at Dappled Things, to pursue like a really wonderful opportunity with Word on Fire, Bernardo asked me to take over as editor-in-chief. So I've been editor-in-chief for a year now.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Katie, because she's a wonderful person and has been on this podcast before. In fact, I think probably we talked a little bit about Dappled Things when she came on to discuss her novel a few years ago, which is wonderful as well. So it's good to get her name in here.
Yeah, and the other thing that Rhonda, hasn't mentioned, I don't know if she's being too humble or something, is that she's quite an accomplished novelist herself. So, that,
excellent.
That was one of the reasons why we asked her to step in as editor-in-chief.
Right. So, Bernardo, you mentioned founding this magazine to fill in a dearth in Catholic literature. Was there anything else you wanted to say about the story of the founding that might be of interest?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so we started in 2005. This was the summer after I graduated from college, had too much time on my hands. And so I said, hey, why not start a magazine? And what was going on at that point was that if you looked at what kind of article was being published in a lot of Catholic magazines or just Christian magazines, it was with regards to literature, it was all about the death of the Catholic novel, what happened to the great Catholic writers, and this kind of doom and gloom approach. And it wasn't entirely fair because there were some accomplished Catholic novelists writing at the time and poets and so forth, but there was a sense of that things were stagnant, and that that kind of like the triumphs of the 20th century when we had so many greats, that was past, and what happened. And I had just had an experience of I had just finished college, right? And during college I had met a lot of really talented people, had gotten more and more interested in literature, and I thought, well, I know all these talented people. There's really a need to highlight the potential that there is here and to give it an opportunity to flourish. So I got in touch with some people, and they also thought that it was a good idea. And within 6 months, we had our first issue up online, published that online for about 2 years, and then we were able to get in print in 2007, and have been releasing a quarterly print edition ever since.
Excellent. I wanted to ask you both about some of your favorite work that has been published in the magazine recently. What about you, Rhonda?
Well, the one that I had sent you, we can talk about that one. That one's a really great one. So The Off Season by Ennis James Sheehan. This one was recently published, and it's a short story about a guy taking his dog for a walk on an LA beach and encountering a homeless man, and then getting harassed by the cops. And I won't give away the ending. And it sounds, it's a really interesting one because both the man he's kind of driftless, but the dog was a rescue. I mean, he was a lost dog that he's just sort of adopted, but there's this kind of sense of, that I don't know, I don't owe the dog anything. Dog doesn't owe me anything, but it turns out he actually really loved the dog. And it was such this story. I just love how there's something in the tone of it. There's something in just the irony, but also the humor of, the irony. There's a punch to it, but it's not bitter. But it's also very true to life. And, encountering these kind of just, in something very small, there's a lot of human longing in in this, relationship between this man and this dog. And then it turns out in the end, how it flips around on him. So, the tone of it is we were talking about this in our a little bit beforehand
to record. Yeah.
We were saying, it has a very 21st century voice. It has a very contemporary voice. And we were talking about this a little bit, like that the magazine and our Catholic tradition has such a broad, 2 millennium long tradition of arts and letters, right? And then oftentimes, as Bernardo was saying, where did all the Catholic literature go, right? It's like, oh, the mid-century, and now we've lost it. And now where did it go? And doom and gloom. But then it turns out that I think we just need to look at it in something like this story where I think, oh my goodness, like this is today, and there's something very particular about it. I'm actually reminded of a different novelist, sometimes contributor to Dappled Things, but the novel The City Mother by Maya Sinha. Again, contemporary Catholic, very fresh voice. And so there's something kind of emerging, I think, with the 21st century. And this is just happens to be a particularly good example of what, the sort of work that we're seeing coming across our desk.
Yeah, of all the things you sent me, that story, The Off Season, was my favorite. And yeah, it felt contemporary without being self-consciously so, without being overly topical. It's sort of contemporary, very recognizable, but sort of timeless in its scenario, really. There's nothing that couldn't have happened in the 1950s for the most part, but still feels very sort of modern in its psychology. And what about you, Bernardo? Any favorite pieces you can mention?
Sure. So I wanna start by drawing a little bit of attention to the visual art. We have a featured visual artist for every issue, but then in addition to that, we sometimes have contests, and some of the work from a couple of contests has been great. We had a few years ago the Josephine Bakhita Prize for visual art, focused on the idea of human dignity, and got some like really interesting pieces from that. A lot of them came kind of from a multicultural context, and it helped for us really kind of highlight the universality of the church and of approaches to that. More recently, we had a contest more focused on sacred art, and specifically that came about because I had wanted to deepen a devotion to the Sacred Heart. And when I started looking for a Sacred Heart image to put inside my house, I just couldn't bring myself to get any of them because most of them were so awful. Because a lot of the art for the Sacred Heart, unfortunately, was really kind of influenced by that kind of like 19th century, perhaps, like overly romanticized Jesus with Pantene hair and like what looks to be something like makeup almost, and it's just like, no.
Do you want to see mine?
Go ahead.
I'm going to take this off the wall because I looked long and hard for a good Immaculate Heart and Sacred Heart pairing, and they're not by the same painter. I'll just show you the Sacred Heart one. All right. I just want to show this since you mentioned it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you may or may not like it.
So that is much better than what I was finding.
Yeah.
That is much better than what I was finding. The typical Sacred Heart image, that it is hard to find one that doesn't fall into what I described before. And there are exceptions. I eventually found one. But I'm sure that you had to look hard.
I did, yeah.
So I felt like, it's kind of terrible that we have very talented. One thing I want to say, by the way, is the good news here about these 20 years of Dappled Things is that we've been able to see this kind of flourishing in a lot of the arts, and visual arts is no exception. And I've been delighted to find through my work with the magazine to find out about all these awesome visual artists that are working right now.
Right.
And I thought, they're doing great stuff. Let's see what there is that people who are working right now can bring to this wonderful devotion. So we did a contest for that. I keep saying context for some reason. We did a contest for that, and we ended up getting some really wonderful submissions among the winners, and we were really pleased with the result. I encourage everybody to go look it up.
Yeah, that was good stuff. I really liked those pieces.
Yeah. There is great work that people are doing right now. If people are still under the impression that in order to find good Catholic writing or good Catholic art, you have to look back, 100 years or more, that is no longer true.
I would be interested to see a Divine Mercy version of this. Now,
I've thought about doing a contest for that too.
Now you might not be able to be as diverse with it because the background to that is that Jesus gave Saint Faustina particular instructions about what have him paint me as you see me with this particular posture, my hand raised in this way, not above my shoulders, in this sort of like non-threatening way, and all this stuff, and she had the painting made, and she was really disappointed with it. The one that there's like sort of two versions that you see around. One of them has the blue ray instead of the white ray, and that's not the original one. But she was really disappointed with the sort of the main one. She felt it didn't convey what she saw, and Jesus said, well, like, don't worry about it because the power of this image is I'm paraphrasing, but he said not in the painter's brush, but in my,
Right.
my grace, essentially.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, it would be great to have a piece, and I've seen icon versions of this, which were pretty good, for instance.
Yeah.
It would be great to have a piece that really followed the sort of the canons, laid out by Jesus, but was just much better.
Right.
I have the original one hanging in my house, a pretty large one, but I would love to have one that
Yeah, and I will say
like better
I
as a
like
work
the
of art.
original better than the one that is more popular that you
Oh,
see.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree.
But yeah, I mean, there's no reason for, like, there are many different styles that you can bring to sacred art,
That's right.
and the popular images that there are of the Divine Mercy are just some very specific approaches, but you could do it in many different ways. And I know, for example, Daniel Mitsui has a pretty unique one that he has tried with that. But I would love to see other people, like the winners of the Sacred Heart contest, try their hand at it too.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say too that there's something unique. I'm just thinking about those winners. I think it's like someone like Gwyneth Thompson Briggs, who I know we had mentioned beforehand. I follow her on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it these days, and so she'll post these pictures of her painting. Not like the work, but on occasion somebody will snap a picture of her painting. And she's always, not only is she painting and she's got her canvas, but she's got her baby in a sling. And I think like there's just something really beautiful about Catholic artists and seeing them doing their art, but also
Sure.
living out their vocation as they do this. And
Yes.
and that carries into the work, whether it's visual art or it's poetry or it's fiction or nonfiction, whatever it is, that we're not just simply interested in people who are Catholic culturally or Catholic by name, even though we do include, anybody who really, we have people in the magazine who, are like Catholic adjacent publishing with us too, So,
Mhm.
it's not like we don't draw strict boundaries, but it's lovely to see and to have a place that's open to people who are legitimately living out that vocation. So she's just one example, just
Right.
looking at her public presence. And I think
Yeah.
that's really beautiful, and it does come through.
Yeah, that's great. Now you both have mentioned this narrative about this mid 20th century peak, Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, the two names that often get mentioned. I think that actually, I talked to Joshua Wren about this the first time I had him on the podcast, that I think that sort of group is good, but like has its limits, even artistically, to be honest. But my question is, this is a narrative that feels very contemporary to me. So I wanted to ask you, how much have we actually moved past that narrative, or have we moved past it in fact, but not in getting the message out there that things have changed?
Yeah, I would say that seems like that rings true to me. I would say this. First of all, we anything I say here doesn't. I am not casting shade on any of those writers. I love them.
Sure.
I love Flannery O'Connor. I love Evelyn Waugh. I love Graham Greene. So on and so forth. Walker Percy. But yeah, we can't stay there forever, right? And it's been beautiful to see in the last 20 years that more and more we are getting new writers who actually are not only producing great work, but actually producing great work that is being recognized, not just by Catholics, but even in the mainstream culture. The thing is that sometimes the fact that these are Catholic writers is not as clear to people, not because of anything in their work, but I think people haven't been paying as much attention to that aspect of it, but it's very much there in their work. And this goes back even to, just the beginning of the 21st century. Carlos Ayer, who's a historian at Yale, he's also an immigrant from Cuba. And he wrote a memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana. I think it was published 2004, if I'm not mistaken. that won the National Book Award and was huge. And a lot of people connected with that book. Well, the funny thing is that I read that book a few years after it was published. We had already started Dappled Things. And as soon as I kept reading it, just because I had been interested in hearing about it, but I didn't know that it had anything to do with Catholicism. But as I kept reading it, I was like, this guy's Catholic. I'm sure this guy's Catholic. I just, the more I read it, the more sure I felt about it, and that he was up to something with that. And so I looked up his Yale email address and just shot him a cold email and said, I just finished your book. I love it for these and these reasons, in which I talked about the kind of faith aspects of the book. And within 4 hours, he shot me back an email that basically said something like, finally, somebody gets it. Because there had been this whole aspect to his book that, even though it had been discussed a lot, people just were not paying attention to. And there's a Catholic writer writing with, aspects where there are aspects of faith that are really going into the work and are at the heart of the work. But that people kind of keep under the radar. And he's not been the last this century. Phil Clay won the National Book Award. And for his book, Redeployment, which is a book of short stories, where he's a veteran of, I think, both Iraq and Afghanistan. And and he talks about his experiences there. And it's a really intense book. One of the short stories in that book, it's called Prayer in the Furnace, is, I don't know, one of the best short stories I think that I've ever read. And it is really intense because what he does there is that I just found so compelling is that the story focuses on two characters, one of them being a Catholic chaplain in the army, and things keep getting worse, like really, really bad. And he kind of, through the story, like stacks the deck against Christianity in the strongest way I think you could stack it. And the resolution of the story kind of deals with that knot, and actually you see the power of the faith in the real world, in a world where things are really going wrong, all the more strongly because of what he does through it. And I thought that was such a compelling read, as well as many of the other stories in that book, but especially that one. And he's published a second novel, or I guess that would be his first novel, Missionaries, which is also really, really good. And we have many other writers that are doing great work, and that maybe the aspect, the fact that they're part of, let's say, a Catholic literary movement hasn't been paid as much attention to, and many Catholics don't even realize it. But there are these works out there right now that are recent works that are being published by current writers, and that are really, really excellent.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add on to that, so what we do as Dappled Things is facilitate wherever we can, and so, yeah, I mean, almost everybody on our board is a practitioner in their own right? I mean, we have writers and poets and on the board as well, on our editorial board, but we also, you recognize that there's a place for the midwife to help people bring that work into being and to bring it to the world. And so there's, in that sense, there is this, for us, this is 20 years of trying to do this and to be a place where this happens. Bernardo, did we interview Phil Clay some years ago? I feel like I think somebody someone interviewed him for us. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, he's a good guy. And his novel was very interesting to me because his wife is Colombian, and I grew up in Colombia, and so half of the book takes place in Colombia, and he's looking in this book, he's looking for kind of reflecting again on his experience as a veteran, where there are these veterans in Afghanistan and they're kind of sick of what's going on there. They feel like they're wasting their time and making no progress, but they want to do their thing somewhere where it means something. And so somebody tells them, oh, well, if you want a good war to fight, go to Colombia. And then you find what happens there when they go try to fight that good war. And it gets complicated from there. But yeah, another writer that I have greatly enjoyed that's publishing some really great stuff is Christopher Beja. And then our own editors are publishing some great stuff. So, you've had Katie Carl, Joshua Wren is a former editor, Rhonda and Karen Ulo, and each of them is publishing, different work. One of the things that I find really encouraging about this burgeoning renaissance, if you want to call it that, is that it's not just one kind of writing that is rising. Like, Rhonda is writing, let's say, a more kind of popular novel, but quality popular novels, and she has actually a whole defense of that. That is very important, I think. So yeah, you tell him.
Well, actually, this before we get to that, this sort of ties in what you just mentioned. Ties into a question I was about to ask, which is, okay, so I've noticed a lot of the contemporary Catholic novels I've read, and this is work that I like. So don't get me wrong here. A lot of the stories are about professors, artists, intellectuals, right? I don't feel like, granted, Crime and Punishment is technically about a student who's into these new ideas and stuff, right? But I don't feel like most great storytelling of world civilization has been about other artists, like artists writing stories about themselves and only what they know. Mm-hmm. And there's another, a different, this is a sort of a different thing, but also when I was talking to Joshua Wren in our first interview, I mentioned one reason I felt like Flannery O'Connor was sort of, and this really is a totally different issue, is somewhat limited, even though I love her, is that she and Walker Percy too are dealing with like very particularly modern kind of psychology and pathologies, and whereas like, and people will groan, but I'm going to say like Tolkien, for instance, he's certainly a modern person. We shouldn't underestimate that aspect of his writing and how relevant it is, but it doesn't feel like it's just about the problems of his time in the same way. Now that's a separate issue, but what I really wanted to ask is, and maybe this will lead to Rhonda's work, is how many people are out there, especially in the Catholic scene, who are just writing like stories about stuff, and it doesn't have to be only write what you know, meaning I have to write about a person who's like me, who's an intellectual, who's an academic, or who's an artist of some kind. By the way, my favorite three Catholic novels that I've read, contemporary Catholic novels I've read, are Katie Carl, As Earth Without Water. That's the name, yeah. Which is about an artist or two artists. Trevor Cribb and Merrill, Minor Indignities. That's a campus novel, and Daniel McInerney's book, The Good Death of Kate Montclair, and she's a professor, and that's dealing with modern ideas and stuff. And I love all of those books, but at the same time, I just wonder how much mileage can we really get out of only writing about professors and artists. So obviously, Phil Clay, those are the stories from a military man's point of view. So you've already given an example, but maybe Rhonda, you can talk about this because Bernardo said you write popular novels, and so I assume that has to mean not novels about intellectuals, right?
I have sailors, and I'm in 1793. I'm way back and having way too much fun.
Right.
Right. By the way, I'm a lover, so I've learned a lot about sailing and the age of sail. As I've gone along, and this is like the joy. So I don't write what I know, but I had to learn it, and it was just love, just absolutely.
I thought you said you were a lover, and I was like, what does that have to do with?
I'm a lover.
Land lover.
Land
okay.
lover.
Yeah. Okay.
No, but I love the water. So I guess maybe like this is, one of the things that, so several years ago, I wrote a piece for Catholic World Report, talking about the popular novel and where it falls.
Yeah, the popular novel, otherwise known as the novel.
The novel. Thank you.
Until the 20th
you.
century, it was just the novel, and it was suspected as trashy for that reason,
And this is. Thank you for saying this. Yes. And this is part of what Bernardo is talking about, right? It's that we do a disservice when we only talk to each other in this sort of insular, hoity-toity circles talking to each other. Like this is the Catholic Church. Like this is in America, this is the church of immigrants. This is the church of rich people and poor people and everybody in between. And it's not stories are for everybody, right? I mean, Christ is the storyteller par excellence, right? And so we want stories that hit on truth. We want good stories for everybody. And so, so whatever that's going to be, I think we should, as a writer myself, and I think, as a fiction writer, I think like I have to give myself permission to write the story that has been given to me in my imagination through prayer. And that is, we definitely want to make space for whatever form that's going to take. I want to just mention a Chrism Press novel, but somebody who also passed through Dappled Things is Mary Jessica Woods. And she wrote a sci-fi space opera called Mark Maker, about an alien tattoo artist who lives on like a legacy ship. And there's like these ceremonial tattoos, but then there's this whole underbelly of outcasts that they're not supposed to receive these ceremonial tattoos. And anyway, in the Mark Maker, Marikel, the main character, breaks his oath and he has a truth-telling oath, and he breaks his oath and he breaks the law in order to bring these outcasts, this basically what is their liturgy.
Yeah. And by the way, listeners, just while we're on the topic, don't get a tattoo. Anyway, go on.
Well, they're aliens.
So this is like a key part of their culture. It's a really interesting, like, her world building is really cool.
Yeah, but the thing is that I want to tell you something, Thomas, because I am a historical novelist. I write realism. So I write historical realism. I do not have, I am not, my brain, my imagination does not veer toward anything fantasy, anything sci-fi. It just doesn't. My imagination doesn't work in that path. When I read Mary's manuscript, at the acquisition stage, I was hooked. I was like, oh, this is why people like this, And the thing with Mary, and it's just to give her a shout out, is that she's Byzantine Catholic, and so this is a book without mentioning God once, but it's deeply sacramental. Right. And so that's the sort of thing where you think, okay, this is about a subject that is, you think like, oh, it's genre fiction or whatever, but it's actually very well written and well endorsed by many people that you would respect. And you think about that and you're like, yes, absolutely. Like we need a place for this where, okay, the setting has a particular setting, but it's hitting on something universal, right? And I think this is your point about, the mid 20th century where you're like, okay, at what point do you have the particularities of that day and time and of that particular setting? And then, okay, and how much of that is time bound and how much of this is timeless? How much of this is going to be universal? And you just don't know.
That raises the question too of, I don't even mean fantasy and sci-fi in particular, but does Dappled Things find itself publishing much genre fiction? So that would include obviously like even like Westerns, detective things, that kind of thing.
Well, I would love to publish a Western or a detective fiction. But I should give a shout out to the Collegium Institute, which at the University of Pennsylvania, who has graciously taken us under their wing. This fall, we are going to be doing a series, a global Catholic literature series on Catholic detective fiction.
Oh. Okay.
And so, yeah. So,
Of which there is a surprising pedigree, right?
Absolutely.
To go back to the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century greats.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, just to add to the plug, this is something that people can sign up to do as a webinar basically series. So it's kind of a fun time. And one thing, by the way, it's a series that we're looking at global Catholic literature, so we're actually specifically kind of going beyond just the Flannery O'Connor stuff, although we have done Flannery O'Connor because those are very popular. But you'll get to do a lot of Catholic literature that you often don't hear about as much. To add to, since you were asking for examples, another really good one. I don't know if you've come across the novel Eifelheim. So
I've heard of it.
So this is from 2006. It's a Hugo Award finalist. So it's a science fiction novel. It's really, really good. It's the basic premise for it is that aliens land in medieval Germany, and stuff ensues from there. Half of the novel takes place back in medieval times, half of it in the present, where these scientists are kind of trying to figure out that something weird happened in this town, and they're trying to figure out what it is. And really, really imaginative, really well written, very interesting story. Because a lot of topics of science and faith, of course, become part of it, it's a good example of something very different from this kind of typical thing that you've been talking about. But there's a lot of other examples. I mean, actually, there's a burgeoning genre of Catholic vampire fiction, believe it or not. I think it's funny because I don't know if you've ever. I used to be a teacher, and so there you go. As a teacher, I would often do icebreakers with students, and one of the icebreakers we would do was two truths and a lie, right? Where you tell two things about you that are real and one that is a lie. And one of the things that I started using for a truth that sounded like a lie was that I had two friends who had published a vampire novel. And then after a year of doing that, I had three friends who had published a vampire novel, which I can't believe because my friends don't seem like the type who would, I don't know, we're not like that into vampires. But turns out that there's several Catholics who got into that, and there's some actually pretty good.
Well, I mean, the original Dracula is very Catholic. So.
Absolutely.
Right.
I couldn't believe how good that book was when I first read it. I was like, I didn't expect this to be nearly as great as it was.
Absolutely. Yeah, actually, so one of these novels, so Eleanor Donlan, who is also a former Dappled Things editor, she edited the Ignatius Critical Edition version.
Well, Eleanor Nicholson.
Sorry, I'm using her old name. So Eleanor Nicholson, she was the editor of the Ignatius Critical Edition version of Dracula, and then she published her what would you call it, Rhonda? Like she wanted to
correct the errors or something.
Correct the errors that Dracula made, because she felt like Dracula didn't make he didn't have a good plan to take over England, and so in her novel, which is called The Bloody Habit, and it's really good. There's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor in it too. There's she tries to have Dracula come up with a better plan. And it's not Dracula himself, but it's another vampire. And there's also a character in it that who's a Dominican, and that's why it's called The Bloody Habit. The Dominican is let's say the vampire slayer.
He's just like this Chestertonian fat friar who in good Dominican fashion is fond of puns. I'm a lay Dominican, and almost every Dominican I know likes puns.
Yeah, and she's published a series of those. So then she had one with werewolves and Franciscans. It's called Brother Wolf, and her latest is with Irish folklore. And what's the name of this one? I'm blanking
Wake
right now.
of Malice.
Wake of Malice, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the thing with that is that Eleanor's a great example of somebody who's writing contemporary fiction with a contemporary, mindset, and she's got to understand, but she's also really steeped in a literary tradition as well. So like if you said she's writing horror, she would, she would say, oh, wait, hold on, like what do we mean by that? Because, she doesn't write slasher, like a slasher film would scare the living daylights out of her. She like she would admit that herself. But rather like saying, okay, there's a tradition called Gothic, right? And then there's Gothic literature specifically that's Victorian. Okay. And Eleanor's, really steeped in that. And then she's taking that and she's bringing this into a Catholic imagination where, she's like in the Gothic tradition, scary papists is a theme, right? Mm-hmm. They want to borrow, especially in Victorian literature, in English Victorian literature, they're wanting to borrow all of the trappings of Catholicism, but then at the same time, like hold it at arm's length.
Right.
Whereas like with Eleanor, she is a Catholic, right? And so she's like, no, what does the Gothic do? Right. It's the funhouse mirror. It shows us the worst of us. It shows the worst of our sins, but in a way that it's distorting things, right? So in like a werewolf situation, right? The vampires are dead, right? They are the undead, but a werewolf is still alive. But a werewolf, what does that show us? It shows us our animalistic tendencies, right? And it shows us what we do, and we're bestial. And so, but a werewolf can be rehabilitated. And she does this. The Franciscans are in charge of rehabilitating werewolves. I don't know if you knew that, but apparently that comes from straight down from the top, from the Pope.
Well, the legend of the Wolf of Gubbio, right? Is the
right, exactly. And so, but it's like you're taking this into, and she's having fun, right? I mean, and so these are mysteries too. Eleanor's also happens to be really steeped in, in the classic mystery, tradition as well. And so these are Gothic novels with a mystery plot put into it. Okay. Yeah. And so, right. It's like, this is unique.
And a lot of humor. There's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor.
Tons of and it's like, this is interesting and, it's interesting and accessible and well thought out. And, Eleanor also is a lay Dominican, and her husband is Eleanor's got some advanced degree in literature. Her husband's a philosophy PhD. They're coming at it. They're smart. They're coming at it, but it's like, you can read it.
It's a fun read.
Fun.
Right.
It's a good read.
Right.
Like, God forbid something be fun,
Yeah. Bernardo, you mentioned this global perspective a couple times, and that just makes me think about how sometimes we can get out of our kind of ruts and what we expect of contemporary art by looking at how things are done in other places. And I don't know how much sort of translated work or work from elsewhere Dappled Things has been involved with, but I'm more familiar with contemporary cinema, contemporary Catholic cinema, and global cinema than I am with global fiction, contemporary Catholic fiction, novels and such, because of my film podcast, Criteria. And, just to give an example, I find that Catholics in the U.S. are so stuck in this kind of Hollywood model, and it has to meet these Hollywood type stylistic standards, to be a real movie. And somebody in our comments for a while was commenting, you got to check out this Indian director, Lijo Jose Pellicery, and he was recommending a particular film by him as, very Catholic. And we finally watched a few of his movies and did an episode about him. And boy, this guy is fascinating. He's not Catholic himself. He has a sort of vaguely Christian background, doesn't seem to be practicing, but he grew up in the sort of the Catholic part of India in Kerala. Mm-hmm. And his movies all have Christian references, and even many of them are, I would say most of them are set in specifically Catholic parts of India, and that really factors into the stories. And this guy is, you would call it, he's part of this Malayalam new wave. Malayalam is the language they speak in Kerala. And you would call it like art house cinema, except it's very popular there. Like this guy's making hits, but it's like this stuff that would just be totally off the wall in America. So to just give an example, if anybody would go watch one film by this guy, that would be like the most entertaining to suck you in. There's a movie called Jallikattu, and it's this remote village, Catholic village in India, and this bull escapes from the butcher and just starts wreaking havoc and stampeding through the village, and all these guys are out to be the person who catches and kills this bull. And as the film goes on, they just become more and more animalistic and competing for this bull. So it's kind of like, and the movie is framed with quotes from the book of Revelation about like Satan being let loose for a time and, you know, all this stuff. And so you see these people just, this mob behavior getting more and more crazy as they try longer and longer to catch this bull. And it is the most wild, like, movie you can imagine. And no, aside from Apocalypto by Mel Gibson, which it kind of has some similarities to in terms of its foot chase kind of theme, no Catholic filmmaker in the US would dream of making something like this. And granted, they don't have the same cultural perspective that this guy has, but it's so creative and such a high aesthetic standard that puts, frankly, most contemporary Hollywood products to shame, let alone, you know, sort of whatever indie Catholic cinema we have in the US. So not to go on too long about that, but I just wish that people would check out stuff like that and sort of open their idea of what a film could be. Likewise, I'm wondering if you have any examples of that kind of global perspective, which could really open up the idea of what contemporary Catholic literature could be.
Right. So I will preface this by saying that I know a guy who's probably the guy you really want to talk to about this. But I'll tell you, I mean, from my own experience. So I grew up in Colombia, and it's there's something interesting in among contemporary writing there, because it is such a Catholic culture, and for that reason, sometimes I feel like where kind of self-consciously Catholic literary movement arises is in those places where the writers feel like they're like they have to be against the dominant current in some way, right?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
And so sometimes you find less of that specific kind of approach there, but on the other hand, you have this culture that is steeped in a Catholic worldview. And so, for example, for me, I mean, I think a very big influence as a Colombian was obviously Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He, in many ways, is he's a lapsed Catholic, and if you get into his politics, he was a friend of Fidel Castro and all sorts of things like that. But when it comes to his writing, I think there is, in many ways, something that is deeply Catholic about it, because when you start getting into his novels, a lot of people call them magical realism, right? And when they've asked him what he thinks of that, what Garcia Marquez used to say was that he didn't consider magical realism to be a thing. That for him, there was basically just the reality of life as we saw it in Latin America, and that other people call that magical realism. And I think that is very relevant today, where I think recently books like Rod Dreher's Living in Wonder, and there's been a whole discussion around the idea of disenchantment and reenchantment, right? And one thing I'm intending to review Dreher's book in Dappled Things, and I liked a lot of things about it. But one of the things that I felt where he in many ways is critical of the Western Church in general, both Protestant and Catholic, for almost adopting a very materialist view of the world, and then kind of overlaying some faith over that, right? But kind of assuming a generally disenchanted view of the world. And I would say that might be true of parts of the Western Church, but certainly not true in Latin America. And Latin America is the Western Church too. So
It's true.
so in that context, the idea that the spiritual and the physical go hand in hand, that the natural and the supernatural make part of our lives day to day is very much a real thing. And I have I've actually kind of been toying with the idea of writing a short little book of just family stories called "The Family Miracles: Impossible Things That Happen to People I Know." Right, and it's I have, for example, a cousin and her husband who her husband, as far as I know, has not really been a believer in the supernatural in general, I think, but they had an experience where they thought that these employees that were working for them in his architecture firm were using superstitious excuses to avoid extra work or staying around late because they said there were ghosts in the house, stuff like that. And they always poo-pooed it, thought it was so ridiculous. And until they sold the house to somebody who was demolished it. They were going to make a big building there. And turns out that when they demolished the house, under the house, they found this metal box. And inside the metal box was some sort of bag. And inside the bag were human bones. All of this under the foundation of the house. And after they saw that, all of these stories from people who they worked with saying that there were ghosts in the house suddenly seemed a lot, more worth taking seriously.
Right.
And there were all sorts of things where people, all sorts of stories where the idea that the supernatural does influence our everyday lives is kind of taken for granted, even by what you could say is very modern, very highly educated people.
Right.
And so I think that's an aspect that you can see in the writing from other cultures that I think coalesces really well with one thing that I think ought to be more deeply explored by Catholic writers today, because I think the idea of the materialist universe really is kind of wearing thin, and I think that people are ready for a different way of looking at things. But the question then is, are we going to look at things from a perspective that leads us towards, let's say, the occult and that kind of thing, or are we going to
I literally just wrote a 30-page essay on that exact topic. So
okay,
yeah.
Well, there you go. So that and so that I think is an important question, and I think that's an aspect, I think, that what we consider to be realist writing has really not dealt with. It's almost, you can't bring that stuff in, right? But you need to, because whatever you think of these things, these experiences that are strange are a part of human experience. However you explain them, they do make a part of human experience. And I think you find that if you start looking at people's, just their own families, I don't think my family is that exceptional. I think if any of you start asking around stories within your family, you will start finding people who have stories of really odd things that have happened to them that they don't really know how to understand, but what we tend to do today is we just kind of say, well, that was weird, and just pick ourselves off and pretend it didn't happen. But what if there's more to that? And what if we actually have to take that into account into how we understand reality?
And I think, like, if you're going to say, like, we want, on one hand, if you think about the movements in the 20th century. I'm thinking of the essay, Cassandra Nelson's Theology of Fiction. Recently was Wise Blood Books, Joshua Wren's press published it as one of their folio collections or whatever. And she was going through the kind of the history of how the mid-century, how different Catholic writers carved out a place for writing something not pietistic. Like they wanted something that was hitting in that realism category, right? They wanted to talk about the hard things. And so they had to fight for that, right? And so then you have, the fruit of that is a Flannery O'Connor, is a Walker Percy, are these authors who had a place to write for it while still being good children of the church, right? But like, I think, unfortunately, I think this is what Bernardo is saying, there's a tendency in this country in particular, and especially when you fight so hard for realism, is that you don't want to abandon a supernatural view. And so, so there's this question of like, well, how does that look? And the thing is, it's like, even just the name realism, it's like, well, actually, what is real?
Right, exactly. And it ends up being a somewhat artificial limitation for Catholics to say, well, it's better to just have the themes in there, but I don't ever actually mention God or, the Catholic Church. Depending on the genre, that can be appropriate or, whatever God inspires you to do. But the idea that this is the ideal, that like it'd be sort of invisible and only affect the reader subliminally, it seems like arbitrary that you could not just mention stuff that's part of your life.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's kind of my point, is that that view of realism there's nothing that real about it. We need to have a more comprehensive understanding of that. And I think if you're looking for, I already mentioned this, but if you're looking for somebody who was writing recently in a way that is really compelling and that kind of brings that into it, it's Carlos Ayer's memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana. I think he does that beautifully there. And it's not surprising, since he's coming from a Cuban culture, where a lot of these things are brought in. And it's beautifully done. It is hilariously done. It's one of those books where you're reading one paragraph and literally laughing out loud, and then the next paragraph he punches you in the gut. And there's all these crazy things going on, and you see the hand of God through all these things that happen in his real life as a kid, during the Cuban Revolution, and then having to leave by himself as part of many children that were sent away from Cuba on their own, and make his way by himself in the U.S. So it's a very realistic story in many ways, but it's also a story that doesn't have a cramped view of what that means.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, in at Dappled Things, I would say we're interested in this. We're interested in a spectrum of stories. And I think it's like we're all coming at it from a different cut. And, we want to be inclusive in that sense, like we want to hear the story.
Right.
And there's any number of ways that come at truth.
So we have to wrap up in a moment, but one last question has to do with, you mentioned Chrism Press and other initiatives that have sort of grown out of the community that Dappled Things helped to foster. So we don't have a ton of time to detail each one, but if you guys just want to rattle off a number of these initiatives that have come out of Dappled Things in some way, that would be great.
You want to go first? Okay, so probably the one that I think is getting a lot of traction is Wise Blood Books. Joshua Wren. Right. So he was editor-in-chief, managing editor.
No,
I feel like
he's managing editor.
Managing editor. I feel like I was going to say he's held a couple different roles. So Chrism is another one. Golly, what?
Our managing editors tend to leave to fund small presses.
I know, it's kind of it should be a cautionary tale for anybody who decides they want to be managing editor. What else have we?
Well, now Katie Carl
Is
is, you know, our
Luminor.
former editor-in-chief, is starting Luminor with
Word on Fire.
Word on Fire.
Mm-hmm.
We're very excited about what's going to go on with that. And then also Joshua Wren and James Matthew Wilson, who's a big friend of the magazine, started
the podcast. Yeah.
And yeah, he's fantastic. And they started an MFA program where there are a lot of new, you know, it's a Catholic MFA program for creative writing, and lots of great things coming out of that. And there's also several small magazines that have cropped up. So when we started, we were pretty much the only Catholic literary magazine. There's now Catholic poetry magazine, specifically Presence. There are several other regional magazines. So there's Vermilion out of Catholic U. I'm forgetting the name right now. What's the one in Louisiana that was recently started?
Joie de Vivre.
Yeah.
Forgive my terrible French.
Yeah, and that one seems like really good. There's really great stuff. James Matthew Wilson, I think, is starting one too.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
No, I was just thinking, for us, really, like, the more the merrier. It really shows that there is, some traction to what's going on, and there is, a wealth of. If you are looking for good writing from contemporary writers, you can definitely find it now.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's a number of definitely Catholic specific initiatives and publishers doing a lot of really interesting things. And then the hope is, okay, yeah, we're fostering that inside the community, and then hopefully that's spreading out. And that might just be on an individual author level. I know I have a very small but solid reader base, and not all of them are Catholic, so that's fine. That's great.
Right. Yeah, that even happens with this podcast. Occasionally I get a listener's Protestant or something like that. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. We could talk forever, but this was really fun and great to sort of, see what's going on in the Catholic literary world these days. Thank you so much, Rhonda and Bernardo, for joining me.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to make one final plug to stay tuned for our 20th anniversary edition that's going to come out in probably early 2026,
mm-hmm.
Which is going to be kind of an anthology of 20 years of what we've published. And in addition to that, it's going to have reflections on on Dana Gioia's essay, The Catholic Writers Today, The Catholic Writer Today, that came out about 10 years ago. We're going to kind of look back at that and say, well, what do we think about that now, and what's going on now, and not just in terms of writing, but in the arts and so forth, like visual art and so forth.
And Bernardo is going to be interviewing Dana for this. So,
oh, great.
Yeah. And we'll have some reflections, some feedback on that from other writers and poets. So it'll be great.
All right. Excellent. Thanks again. Everybody, thank you for listening. I will link to Dappled Things and the short story you mentioned and some various other things we mentioned in the show notes for today's episode. And I'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
All right.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.